Economy class in the back, but today the plane's full, so you'll just have to sit here, Olivia Hart said, her tone laced with a faint disdain, drawing chuckles from a few business class passengers. Rachel Monroe stayed silent, settling into 12F. But when the plane made a stop at Andrews Air Force Base, the F-22 squadron commander suddenly halted, looked straight at her, and said loudly, "Midnight Viper, stand up." As minutes later, every F-22 pilot on the runway stood at attention and saluted her, leaving the entire cabin stunned. Rachel's fingers were steady as she tucked her boarding pass into the pocket of her faded gray hoodie. The Seattle airport had been a blur of noise and motion, but now on this packed flight to D.C., the stairs felt sharper, more deliberate. Her hoodie was worn, the cuffs frayed from years of use, and her jeans had a small tear at the knee, barely noticeable, unless you were looking for flaws, which it seemed everyone was. She moved down the narrow aisle, careful not to brush against the luxury carry-ons that lined the path like trophies. A woman in a sharp blazer, her earrings glinting under the cabin lights, glanced up from her phone and gave a quick, dismissive smirk. A man in a pinstripe suit, his tie perfectly knotted, leaned toward his seatmate. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station," he said, just loud enough for Rachel to hear. She didn't flinch. Her steps stayed, even her eyes fixed on the row numbers above. She wasn't here to prove anything. She just needed to get to D.C. The cabin was alive with the kind of energy you feel when people think they're better than everyone else. Business class passengers sipped complimentary drinks, their laughter sharp and self-assured. Rachel slid into 12F, the window seat, and tucked her worn backpack under the seat in front. It was an old thing, army green with a patch from a base she hadn't seen in years. The guy next to her, mid-40s with a Rolex that screamed new money, gave her a quick once-over before turning back to his tablet. His name tag read Richard Hale, and his cologne was strong enough to make her blink. She didn't care. She had learned long ago to let judgment roll off her. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, and her face was bare, no trace of makeup. She looked like she could have been a college kid, scraping by maybe someone who'd snagged a last-minute deal. But Rachel wasn't just anyone. Her file locked away in some classified vault listed her as a reserve recruit. It didn't mention the mission she'd flown for SEAL Team 6 or the discharge that followed under circumstances no one dared whisper about. As Rachel settled into her seat, a young woman in a sleek black dress, her hair styled in perfect waves, leaned over from the row behind. Her name tag read Jessica Lang, and her voice carried a practiced sweetness that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be so excited to be on a plane like this," she said, her tone dripping with pity, like Rachel was some charity case who'd never flown before. A few heads turned, catching the comment, and a soft ripple of laughter spread. Rachel's fingers paused on her water bottle, her thumb brushing the cap. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting Jessica's for a brief moment. "It's just a flight," she said, her voice quiet but steady, like a stone dropping into still water. Jessica's smile faltered and she sat back, flipping her hair with a huff. Rachel turned back to the window, her expression unchanged, but her grip on the bottle tightened just enough to crease the plastic. "Hey, before we go any further, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what this story's making you feel. If you've ever been judged or pushed aside, this one's for you. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. It means a lot to share this moment with you. All right, let's keep going." The plane hadn't even taxied when the first jab landed. Olivia Hart, the head flight attendant, stood at the front of the cabin, her uniform pressed to perfection, her smile tight as a wire. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes that sized people up in seconds, and a voice that could cut without raising. She'd taken one look at Rachel's boarding pass and decided her worth. "Economy class in the back," Olivia said, her words dripping with just enough disdain to sting. The man in the pinstripe suit, Richard Hale, leaned over to his friend, a guy with a slick haircut and a gold cufflink. "Probably one of those discount ticket people," Richard said, not bothering to lower his voice. Rachel's fingers paused on her backpack zipper just for a moment before she kept stowing it slow and deliberate, like she was counting her breaths. A woman across the aisle, her nails painted a glossy red, snickered softly. Rachel didn't look up. She just adjusted her seatbelt, her hands steady. The plane climbed into the sky, the hum of the engine settling into a steady drone. Rachel gazed out the window, watching the clouds roll past like waves. Her hands rested in her lap, calloused, from years of gripping controls in cockpits most people would never see. The woman with the glossy nails, Tara Wells, leaned toward her friend, a blonde in a silk scarf who smelled like expensive perfume. Bet she's scared sitting near the emergency exit. Tara said, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile, but she didn't turn her head. She just reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate twist. Tara's friend laughed, a sharp sound that echoed in the cabin. Rachel stayed quiet, her eyes on the horizon like she was scanning for something no one else could see. During the meal service, Olivia paused by Rachel's row, holding a tray of business-class menus. She glanced at Rachel's hoodie, then handed the menu to Richard Hale with a warm smile. "I'm sorry, we only have enough for our premium passengers," she said, her voice loud enough to carry her eyes flicking to Rachel with a hint of superiority. A man in a tailored blazer 2 rows ahead turned back, his laugh low and mocking. "Don't worry, she's probably used to fast food," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. The cabin rippled with chuckles, and Rachel's hand stilled on her water bottle. She looked up, her eyes meeting Olivia's for a brief moment. "Water's fine," she said, her voice soft but firm, like a line drawn in the sand. Olivia blinked, caught off guard, then moved on her heels, clicking faster than before. Rachel leaned back, her fingers tapping once against the armrest, a small, controlled motion that said more than words. Hours passed, the cabin settling into a rhythm of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. Rachel sipped her water, her movements precise, like someone who'd been trained to stay calm under pressure. Richard Hale kept glancing her way, his eyes narrowing like he was trying to figure her out. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with condescension. "You look like you're headed to a job interview or something. Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." Rachel turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I'm good," she said, her voice low and steady like a blade sliding into place. Richard blinked, thrown off, then muttered something about kids these days and went back to his tablet. Rachel turned back to the window, her face unreadable, but her fingers brushed the edge of her seatbelt, adjusting it slightly. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the monotony. "Folks, we're making a quick stop at Andrews Air Force Base for refueling. Shouldn't be long." Rachel's head lifted slightly, her eyes sharpening, as she glanced out at the military runway coming into view. Jets lined the tarmac, their sleek shapes glinting under the sun, and personnel moved with purpose below. Her fingers tightened around her water bottle just for a second before she set it down. Olivia, standing nearby, noticed the shift in Rachel's posture. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her tone more suspicious than curious. Rachel didn't answer right away. She just kept looking out, her hands still in her lap like she was seeing something no one else could. As the plane descended toward Andrews, a businessman in a crisp white shirt, his cufflinks gleaming, stood to retrieve his bag from the overhead bin. He glanced at Rachel, then spoke loudly to no one in particular. "Some people don't know their place, do they?" he said, his voice carrying a smug edge. A few passengers nodded, their smiles tight and knowing. Rachel's eyes flicked to him just for a moment before returning to the window. She shifted in her seat, her backpack sliding slightly against her leg. "I know where I am," she said, her voice so quiet it barely reached him, but the weight of it made him pause. He cleared his throat, suddenly interested in his bag, and sat down without another word. The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with unspoken tension. A man in business class, his tie loosened and his voice loud, leaned over his seat. His name tag read Mark Ellison, and he had the kind of grin that screamed he was used to being the loudest in the room. "What, you want to fly a plane?" he said, his laugh sharp and mean. A few people chuckled, their laughter like needles in the air. Rachel turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "I've worked near planes before," she said, her voice calm but firm, like a door clicking shut. Mark's grin faltered and he shifted in his seat, suddenly interested in his drink. Olivia raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. She moved down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply like she was marking the moment. When the plane touched down at Andrews, the cabin's energy shifted. The business class passengers perked up, adjusting their jackets and checking their phones like they were about to walk into a boardroom. Olivia's voice came over the intercom, crisp and professional. "A few select passengers have been invited to meet the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you've been notified." She glanced at Rachel as she spoke, her eyes making it clear who wasn't on the list. Rachel didn't move. She just took another sip of water, her face blank like she'd heard it all before. Her fingers brushed the edge of her backpack, where a small patch of faded eagle caught the light for a moment before she tucked it out of sight. Tara Wells leaned toward her friend, her voice loud enough to carry. "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that," she said, her laugh sharp and practiced. The blonde in the silk scarf whose name tag read Claire Donovan nodded, her lips curling into a smirk. A quiet chuckle came from the row ahead where a guy in a designer polo, Ethan Carter, was scrolling through his phone, his smirk visible even from Rachel's seat. She didn't look up. She just screwed the cap back on her water bottle, her movement slow and deliberate, like she was measuring the moment. The cabin felt heavier now, the air thick with judgment that didn't need to be spoken. As the invited passengers gathered their things, a woman in a designer coat, her perfume sharp and floral, paused by Rachel's row. She looked down at Rachel, her eyes narrowing slightly, and spoke to Olivia in a stage whisper. "You would think they'd screen people better for flights like this," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Olivia nodded slightly. Her lips pursed and handed the woman a complimentary drink. Rachel's hands stilled on her backpack, her fingers brushing the faded eagle patch. She looked up, her eyes meeting the woman's for a split second. "Screening's not my problem," she said, her voice low and even like a quiet challenge. The woman froze her drink halfway to her lips, then hurried back to her seat. Rachel leaned back, her expression unchanged, but her fingers tapped once against the armrest, a small controlled motion. Rachel's eyes flicked to the window where the F-22s stood like sentinels on the tarmac. For a moment, her fingers paused, hovering over the patch on her backpack. She'd sewn it on herself years ago, after a mission that left her hands shaking, but her squadron alive. The memory came unbidden, a night sky lit by tracer fire, the roar of engines, the weight of decisions no one should have to make. She blinked and the memory faded. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling the sleeves down over her hands, and leaned back in her seat. The cabin's chatter felt distant like static on a radio. Major Kyle Bennett stepped into the business class cabin, his uniform sharp of his presence, like a storm rolling in. He was in his late 30s with a jawline that looked carved from stone and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted the invited passengers with a polite nod, shaking hands with Richard Hale and Tara Wells. But then his eyes landed on Rachel sitting quietly in 12F. He froze, his hands still gripping the last handshake. The cabin didn't notice at first, but Rachel did. She met his gaze, her expression steady, like she'd been expecting this moment. Her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, a small grounding motion. Bennett walked straight to her row, his boots heavy against the floor. "Are you Shadowhawk 12? He asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Rachel gave a small nod, her eyes never leaving his. Richard Hale snorted softly like he thought it was a joke. Bennett's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away from Rachel. "My apologies for having you sit here," he said louder now, so the whole cabin could hear. "You're invited to the tarmac immediately." Rachel stood slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were smooth, precise, like she had done this 100 times before. The cabin buzzed with whispers, but she didn't look back. As Rachel followed Bennett toward the exit, a man in a navy suit, his watch glinting under the cabin lights, leaned out of his seat. "This has to be a mistake," he said, his voice loud and confident, like he was addressing a boardroom. "She doesn't look like anyone important." A few passengers nodded, their murmurs growing louder. Rachel's steps didn't falter, but her hand tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening for a moment. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. "Looks can be deceiving," she said, her voice soft but sharp like a blade slipping through silk. The man's mouth opened, then closed, and he sat back, his confidence deflated. Bennett's eyes flicked to the man, a silent warning before he led Rachel out. Outside, the air was sharp with jet fuel and wind. Rachel stepped onto the tarmac, her hoodie flapping slightly. The F-22 pilots stood in a straight line, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable. Bennett's voice cut through the silence. "Attention. This is Midnight Viper, the one who once led 3 squadrons through enemy skies." The pilots snapped to attention, their hands rising in perfect unison to salute her. Rachel returned the salute, her movements crisp, her expression calm but warm. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she lowered her hand. The wind carried the moment, and the cabin windows filled with faces watching. Rachel's eyes flicked to the jets, and for a moment her shoulders softened like she was home. Back on the plane, the mood was different. Richard Hale scoffed, leaning back in his seat. "Sounds like a Hollywood story," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of the engines. Olivia gave a forced chuckle. "Maybe it's just an honorary title," she said, smoothing her uniform. Claire Donovan whispered to Tara, "No way it's real." Rachel didn't look at them. She just stood by the window, her hands in her pockets, watching the jets gleam under the sun. Bennett's glance toward the cabin was cold, like he'd heard every word. Rachel's fingers brushed the edge of her hoodie, a small grounding motion before she turned back to the tarmac. A young officer approached carrying an old flight helmet. It was worn but well kept, the call sign, Midnight Viper, embroidered in bold letters across the side. Bennett took it and held it out to Rachel. This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who's completed a top-secret mission, he said, his voice steady but loud enough for the cabin to hear. Rachel took the helmet, her fingers tracing the stitching for a moment. Then she slipped it on her movements as natural as breathing. The fit was perfect, like it had been made for her. A young pilot barely out of his 20s stepped forward, his voice low. "She's the one who saved my squadron," he said. The other pilots straightened their faces, shifting to something like awe. As Rachel stood on the tarmac, a junior pilot, his face still boyish under his cap, approached hesitantly. He held a small weathered logbook, its edges frayed from use. "Ma'am, you signed this for me 3 years ago," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He opened it to a page marked with her call sign, her signature sharp and unmistakable. The other pilots turned their eyes, softening with recognition. Rachel took the logbook, her fingers brushing the page. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small, genuine smile. "You made it through," she said, her voice quiet but warm. The pilot's eyes shone, and he stepped back, saluting again. The cabin windows were still crowded with faces, but the air felt different now, heavier with something unspoken. Rachel stepped back into the cabin, the helmet tucked under her arm. The passengers were quieter now, but not all of them were convinced. Olivia forced a smile, her voice overly polite. "Well, it's nice to have a special guest," she said, but her eyes flicked to Rachel's scuffed sneakers. Ethan Carter crossed his arms, his voice low but clear. "Probably just a PR stunt," he muttered. Rachel didn't respond. She just bowed her head slightly, her fingers brushing the edge of the helmet. The cabin was split. Some watched her with curiosity, others with skepticism. She didn't care either way. She settled back into 12F, her backpack at her feet, and looked out the window. As the plane prepared for takeoff, a flight attendant younger than Olivia approached Rachel's row with a nervous smile. She held a small pin, a silver eagle, and offered it to Rachel. "This is from the crew, for you know your service," she said, her voice stumbling over the words. The cabin grew quiet, all eyes on the exchange. Rachel looked at the pin, then at the attendant's face. She took it, her fingers careful, and pinned it to her backpack without a word. The attendant smiled, a real one this time, and hurried back to her station. Ethan Carter shifted in his seat, his earlier smirk gone. Rachel leaned back, her eyes on the window, the pin glinting faintly in the cabin light. The plane taxied back to the runway, preparing for takeoff. Rachel's fingers tapped lightly against the helmet in her lap, a slow, steady rhythm. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but before he could finish, another sound cut through a low, powerful roar. 2 F-22s appeared alongside the plane, their wings glinting in the sunlight. Bennett's voice crackled over the radio, clear for everyone to hear. "Midnight Viper, we never got to thank you for last time." Rachel leaned toward the window, her lips curving into a small smile. She pressed the headset she'd been given and spoke, her voice steady. "Hold formation, Eagle 1. The response came instantly, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went silent. Richard Hale froze his drink halfway to his mouth. Tara Wells stared at her phone, her fingers still. Olivia's smile vanished, her hands fumbling with a tray. No one spoke. The F-22 stayed in formation, escorting the plane as it climbed into the sky. Rachel leaned back in her seat, her eyes on the jets outside. The cabin was a different place now. No one looked at her the same way. Mark Ellison, the loud guy with the loosened tie, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado gone. Claire Donovan whispered something to Tara, but it was too quiet to hear. Rachel didn't need to hear it. She'd heard enough. As the plane leveled off, a passenger in a tailored jacket, his face flushed with embarrassment, stood and approached Rachel's row. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Rachel looked up, her eyes steady but not unkind. She nodded once, a small acknowledging gesture, and turned back to the window. The man stood there for a moment, his hands fidgeting before returning to his seat. The cabin felt smaller now, the air charged with a mix of awe and shame. Rachel's fingers brushed the eagle pin on her backpack, a quiet reminder of who she was. The flight to D.C. felt shorter after that. The cabin stayed quiet, the earlier chatter replaced by an uneasy hum. Rachel kept her eyes on the window, watching the F-22 peel away as the plane approached its final descent. Her fingers brushed the patch on her backpack again, the faded eagle catching the light. She'd been 19 when she earned it, flying a mission so classified even her team didn't know the full scope. The sky had been chaos, the radio screaming with orders, but she'd brought them home. Every single one. She blinked and the memory faded, replaced by the sight of the D.C. skyline coming into view. When the plane landed, the passengers moved slowly like they were still processing what they'd seen. Rachel stood slinging her backpack over her shoulder, the helmet tucked under her arm. She didn't rush, didn't linger. She just walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her head high. Richard Hale avoided her eyes, his phone pressed to his ear as he muttered something about a meeting. Tara Wells was typing furiously, her face pale. Olivia stood by the exit, her smile forced her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Rachel didn't look at any of them. She just kept moving her sneakers silent against the floor. At the gate a man was waiting. He was tall, quiet, with a presence that didn't need words. His suit was simple but tailored, and his eyes locked onto Rachel the moment she appeared. He didn't say much, just nodded and fell into step beside her. The passengers from the flight still lingering at baggage claim went quiet. Ethan Carter dropped his phone mid-text, his smirk gone. Claire Donovan looked away, her scarf clutched tightly in her hand. Olivia busied herself with paperwork, her movements jerky. No one needed to say his name. They knew who he was. James Monroe, Rachel's husband, a man whose influence reached places most people couldn't imagine. Before they left the terminal, a young girl, maybe 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Rachel. "Is that the pilot lady?" She whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who'd stayed silent during the flight, looked at Rachel and nodded. "That's her," she said softly, her voice full of respect. Rachel caught the girl's eye and gave a small warm smile, the kind that said she saw her. The girl grinned back, clutching her mother's hand tighter. Rachel's hand brushed James's as they walked on the helmet still under her arm, the eagle pin glinting faintly. The terminal was busy, but people parted as they passed, like they could sense something bigger than the faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers. The consequences came quickly, quiet, but relentless. Richard Hale, the exec in the pinstripe suit, was a mid-level manager at a defense contractor. Someone on the flight had recorded his comments, and the video spread online like wildfire. By the next morning, he was out of a job, his LinkedIn profile scrubbed clean. Tara Wells, the influencer with the glossy nails, found her latest sponsorship deal canceled after the video went viral. Her followers dropped by the thousands overnight, her apology post buried under a flood of comments calling her out. Olivia Hart faced a quieter reckoning, a formal reprimand from the airline for unprofessional conduct. She was reassigned to short domestic routes, her dreams of international flights grounded indefinitely. Jessica Lang's social media presence took a hit when her company distanced itself from her, citing unprofessional behavior. Ethan Carter's startup lost a major investor, the news breaking quietly but decisively. Claire Donovan's law firm issued a public apology for her conduct, and she was sidelined from high-profile cases. Mark Ellison's consulting firm dropped him from their roster, his name erased from their website by week's end. Rachel didn't see any of this unfold. She didn't need to. She'd been through worse than their words missions, where the sky was fire, where one wrong move meant no coming back. This was just noise, the kind of noise she'd learned to tune out long ago. She and James walked through the terminal, their steps in sync, the helmet still under her arm. The D.C. skyline loomed outside, a reminder of why she was here. Not for the passengers, not for the recognition, but for something bigger. Something that had always driven her even when the world tried to make her small. In the end, Rachel stood at the edge of the tarmac, her husband beside her, the city stretching out before them. The wind tugged at her hoodie, but she didn't pull it tighter. She just stood there steady, like she'd always been. The world had doubted her, mocked, had tried to make her feel like she didn't belong. But she wasn't small. She never had been. And for anyone who'd ever been judged, overlooked, or silenced, her story was a quiet promise. You're not alone. You never were. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.